Whosoever will be saved, before all things it is necessary that he hold the Catholic faith.
Welcome to Veritas et Fus, or Truth and Incense, a podcast covering the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, the faith, and the liturgy, which is the public expression of that faith, especially as seen through the Anglican heritage. We're your hosts. I'm Father Gregory Seeley, pastor of St. Thomas of Canterbury in Roanoke, Virginia,
and I'm Father Deacon Lance Davis, curate of All Saints Church in Aiken, South Carolina.
Excellent. I don't like to do a lot of personal banter on this podcast, but I have to comment the last time that you will say that in our podcast. The next Father Lance Davis. So ordination is imminent, and congratulations. So I will offer my congratulations the next one afterward, but I just wanted to say that. So with the election effectively tomorrow in the United States, I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about politics from a Christian perspective, Anglican, but also just Christian in general, bringing in both the Roman teachings and perhaps some Orthodox, because I really feel that the narrative has become so filled with propaganda, making promises, assuming things, what exactly is the government supposed to do for us, how it's supposed to work. And sometimes I think that church doctrine gets lost in rhetoric and propaganda. So to begin with, I think that we really need to look at what I call the four obligations of government. Those four obligations are security, security from enemies, both domestic and foreign, so the military and a police force, infrastructure, roads, bridges, water, drainage and sewage, things like that, and the courts, which again goes along with the police force to secure peace and domestic prosperity and tranquility. One of the documents, I don't remember which, is to establish domestic tranquility, insofar as it is able. It is important, although not essential, that a government create a forum whereby people can voice their grievances, to allow parties to be able to address problems or to address injustices, because injustices can come from either side, either, so we say, the ruling class or the government or what have you, or the moneyed class, as well as the working class or poor. Both of them can have unrealistic expectations, and a forum needs to exist where these can be talked out and these can be addressed peacefully. And those are the main duties of a government. Other duties, for example, education, healthcare, social security, other, foreign aid. These things are not the first and primary duty of a government. Think something like, for example, foreign aid really is the property. I won't say property, but an obligation is also a tough word to use. But it's the domain of the church, who is called to be missionary and called to be charitable. Any kind of foreign aid should really come through the church. It is not the government's job to rescue nations in defense, even in the case of disasters. That isn't to say that it's intrinsically wrong, but it isn't its first duty, and it isn't something that should become an overwhelming passion for any government to do foreign aid. The idea of education, was originally something that was done in the family, and then they would have, families come together, small schoolhouses where communities would have a teacher would come in and would raise the children up, usually being able to, they call it the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic, so they could function in society. And then also teaching them in the whatever the family did to make a living, which again, families used to work together to make a living. You didn't have a breadwinner homemaker per se. And then the church was also very involved in this, teaching them again to read, which allowed them access to the 2 prayers of the Bible and things like this, teaching them morals, right from wrong, and teaching them the catechism and some theology, that they understood God and they understood, their relationship and his nature and things like that. And when it comes to government, I suppose it's kind of a cliche phrase, and I'll pause at this point and I'll let you chime in. But it was, the government that governs the least is the one that does the best. Government should not be something that imposes itself into every area of our lives. It should be something that keeps the peace and provides domestic security, a certain amount of tranquility, and again, laws to allow injustices to be addressed and the like.
Yes, and I think from the outset, any discussion that pertains to the role of government or the nature of an economy in relation to the citizenry, there are 2 points that have to be made. The first is that some forms of governance are more compatible with the Catholic faith than others. There is not a blank slate in terms of how people can be governed. 2, I think in our particular context, we have to be careful to recognize that the founding myth of the United States is problematic in many respects in terms of the Catholic approach to what the government should be. First and foremost, of course, this country was not founded by devout Christians, and certainly not by devout Catholics or Anglicans. But together with that, we have to recognize that the fundamental order of society, the myth of a democratic republic, inverses the natural and biblical hierarchy of powers. Governance from the bottom up is not a biblical model. Authority comes from God. St. Paul is quite clear on this. And God then ordains the temporal authorities that exist, and we, generally speaking, owe them obedience. So with that said, I think that necessarily colors how we as Christians have to navigate our present society and many of the assumptions made therein.
That's a really good point, is that authority to govern is something that initially comes from God, and God being a monarch, a monarchy would be the best form of government. I've heard it argued a number of times that monarchy creates tyranny and despotism. And interestingly enough, Charles Coulomb, a friend of mine who's a very proficient author and has written on this on many occasions, that truly, when you have a monarch, you have a father of a nation, and it is actually less likely to be tyrannical. Obviously, there needs to be a government surrounding that, but it is actually as they say, death by committee in a sense. Once you have a government come in there and no one is responsible for the decisions can be made that are far more lawless and renegade than if one person is responsible for the overseeing of the government and the regulating of a nation, because it is one man, and especially if there's a moral law or a moral structure in place, like in England, where they have a constitution written down and the king is sworn to uphold that, you'll have far more justice than, as you say, in a republic where it's just a matter of the people's voice being heard. You can almost see that right now in the arguing over whether or not to have various and sundry moral judgments, like abortion, for example, being regulated from the state or being regulated from whatever. And it's the people's decision. Well, that is not the divine order. There's a moral authority. There's a moral, there are moral laws that are good, that need to be upheld, even when they aren't popular.
Yes, and this argument that monarchy is undesirable because supposedly it tends toward despotism is really quite facile and ignorant on the face of it. There has been no greater destructive power in world history than what the president of the United States has at his disposal. And in fact, I think one could argue that the 20th century as the great century of overturning historic monarchies and replacing them with various forms of democracy or reputed democracy ruled by the people, has been the most destructive in history towards human life and human flourishing, towards civilization, art, and culture. So I think at the outset, anybody who would seriously claim that monarchy is a threat to humanity and that democracy is its answer is just woefully ignorant of the facts.
No, indeed, and you're right. When the monarchies went down over the course of the 19th century into the 20th, you're right. The 20th century was a century of war by lawless non-royal regimes. In fact, Britain, who was still a monarchy, was on the Allied side and was able to hold the moral compass much straighter. America came in more in defense of Britain, right, than any other reason. Although there's talk about getting them in for obviously the security because the Axis were a threat, but also for the money. I don't want to get too deep in that. I'm not. Don't know that much about America's involvement in World War II, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories there. But you are right that the age of the monarchs for centuries was far more peaceful than the 20th century when the monarchs were gone.
Yes, and I think we have to recognize too that the rallying cry of our more modern times in terms of governance has been an appeal to the people. Collectively or individually, whether we're talking about the communist revolutions, the Third Reich, or modern Americanism. In every single case, the justification is made that this is what's best for the people. The people want this, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I think there's a great deception here because in many respects, while we claim to draw authority from this great mass of the governed, in fact, we have a much more despotic civilization that has existed in many other parts of history. And I think our modern day American government arguably has more direct input and control over the individual's life than the Roman Empire at its height did.
That's probably very true. When you think over just the regulations we have, I mean, the first one that pops to mind is COVID, but there are other areas where the government, out overreach and regulations and impositions are quite substantial to our lives, which you're right. I don't think any government in history, other than some of your like despotic in China or somewhere else or even in Russia, where the government had so much of an intrusion into daily life.
That's right, and the COVID issue brings up a point that I think is quite relevant to the discussion of the role of government in a society. Living as I did in New York City at the time, one of the things I saw that, of course, happened all over this country and all over the world that was appalling and frankly embarrassing was that, one, the governments, many of them, took it upon themselves to order churches to close and to cease all public worship. Perhaps the worst places happened was in England. But coupled with that was, if I may say, the absolute wanton cowardice of the clergy that said, fine, we will obey the government, not the law of God. And this is not to say that there weren't practical considerations for the spread of the disease. It was rather the almost complete and total capitulation to shut the doors and not have any public worship at all. That is an inverse of the proper role of the church and of the faith within a society. And I think that should have been a wake-up call, maybe it was, for many Christians, that something has gone horribly awry in terms of what we think is the proper role of the state in our lives.
No, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, in previous centuries, we'll be in the church praying for an end to COVID rather than shutting the churches down so that the state could take over. And you're right. There was in the U.S., interesting, I didn't know. I knew England, I knew they'd done that. They did it in the U.S. also. I know that a number of churches, the church that I was involved, my bishop, so when I was in the seminary, our bishop said, you will not shut these churches down. There's never been any evidence that anything in the churches led to the spread of any disease ever. In fact, they did a whole study on that while we were the seminary did a whole study on that, was that the common chalice, because of the wine and the precious metals, was actually safer for receiving communion than, in some ways, things of putting something in your hand, because hands have far more, the alcohol and the wine plus the precious metals was actually killed germs. It was actually far safer than it was in some ways than putting something in someone's hand, because hands can transmit germs much more quickly. But the bishop's comment was, if Walgreens is open, if the grocery store is open, then by God, so will the churches be open, and right. Would not allow. Obviously, there was the 6 foot, the every other pew. They did what they could as far as social distancing, singing out many areas, so that you'd have as little talking and such as possible. But they said, you will not. And I think that went through it with a continuum. At least I think that was almost universal.
Yes, and I think this is where we then see not only government overreach, but a complete collapse of a true Catholic hierarchy of needs. And I think it would be fair to say that simplistically, the role of government is at its core to provide the means for people to fulfill their proper duties in their state of life, whatever that might be. And so we would then have to say, well, what is the highest duty that every single person is called to? That's the worship of God. So a proper government would facilitate the means towards true worship. What we saw in COVID was government saying, no, actually, public worship has no value really whatsoever. And so we can just legislate against it.
It was, and it almost became a question of morality, that you would shut down, that you would do these things. It was brought up, no, if you love your neighbor, you'll do these things, including not going to church. And you're thinking, okay, no, you've overstepped yourself significantly in this regard. To call upon the idea of morality and love of neighbor as a reason why not going to church, and why not, allowing people. It's kind of funny because, in the U.S. founding documents, it's the First Amendment. There's the famous, which they state a separation of church and state, although those words show nowhere in any of our governmental documents. The phrase is, shall no law establishing religion, nor impeding the free expression thereof. So it was literally a violation of the First Amendment. It was impeding the free expression of religion. People want to go and pray for this to be over or what have you, and tell them they couldn't do it. was actually a violation of the Constitution.
Well, that's right. And of course, it also goes to show, though, that I think some of these myths of what our government's for and what are the so-called American values have so seeped into many Christians that, we saw so many Christians just capitulate to this without question. And I think on the one hand, that showed just how deeply cultural, in the negative sense, our Christianity has become in this country. That think of all people that quit going to churches altogether in 2020 and never came back. And maybe that is not altogether a bad thing, to be aware of that reality and have a little bit of pruning, perhaps. But I do wonder what would have happened if more of the clergy had acted the way the clergy did, say, during the plague. And they were, of course, the hardest hit in terms of deaths by the plague, because the clergy are the ones out tending the sick, processing in the streets, singing litanies against the plague, all this sort of thing. So to me, all of this goes back to a fundamental problem that we have a very poor sense of the role of the government, the proper role of the government in our society. And, many Christians in this country in particular have idolized the American government. Now, I think, thank goodness, this has changed considerably with those, say, 50 and under. But for a long time, certainly the World War II generation and the baby boomers, many of them have had this idea that the United States government is some sort of God-given divine gift, that freedom is essentially a matter of the individual to do as he or she pleases without coercion or interference from the government. And so you get these strange ideas like we had in the kind of religion I grew up in, a version of evangelicalism, that the President of the United States is essentially supposed to be an anointed position of God to carry forth the Christian gospel to the world, or some such thing like that. And you get these very strange ideas that certainly captured at least one of the ruling parties in the 80s and 90s. And it has not been for the betterment of our state or for the betterment of the faith.
That's a really good point, because you're right. Many people see, and this was something that I think it was something that was a post-World War II. It's hard to know. I was 70s, 80s. By the 90s, I was in monasteries, and I really wasn't engaged with the culture and such. But I was around in California. I was around all kinds of evangelicals, and there really was a sense of. There was a real belief after World War II that because America had come in and changed the direction of the war and done what they felt was, in many aspects true, was what needed to be done and saved the world from the what was happening in Europe and Asia at the time, that God had called them, and they began to look at their documents and they began to look at the structure of America and see it as something divinely inspired, and a pattern and standard for the world. And if you really began to have throughout probably the 60s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s, into 2000 really, I think is when it kind of ended with the second Bush's tenure as president, was we were literally going into other countries where they would have either a monarch or a head leader, often called a dictator, and overthrowing them and trying to impose democracy, because we were so successful, and ours was clearly the best form of government. We would go and overthrow these governments. You had, if I'm not mistaken, the Vietnamese War, Vietnam, which had its own structure. It came in, and we came in there. It was under Kennedy, who was Roman Catholic, and they were making the entire thing Roman Catholic, less by evangelization and more by the government. The head of the state was Roman Catholic, and they were trying to make Vietnam Roman Catholic. And there's a famous the Buddhist monk Thich Quan Duc who burned himself alive, and all protesting the way that they were cracking down on Buddhism. Again, this wasn't really done via evangelization as much as it was almost being done by governmental policy, but it was also, we were making it America. We were taking America and imposing America on other, and you have this, and it is unhealthy because America is a, was founded on Freemasonic ideals much more than Christian ideals, as you alluded, and the idea that okay, we have the three branches of government, which is roughly comparable to that of England and some of the other European nations, but the idea that we don't have an anointed king, the idea that we do not have God called out as being, when you watch the coronation of King Charles a few months ago and compare that with what we have in our country, and you wonder why England was able to have so much more stable and country for so much longer. I mean, they're in trouble now, as most European nations are, but England's 1,000 years old or more and has gone through difficult times, but also has been seen great ages of peace. We're barely 250 years old, and we're on the brink of collapse. And it's because it's not founded on the gospel. It's not founded on this divine order. It's founded on, the idea that man can govern himself if only he takes everyone's opinion and have representative government and what have you. So it is. I think you look you about to say something there.
Well, that's right. I agree. And England, for all of its very severe problems it has right now, also does still, in theory at least, have the tools at its disposal to correct those problems. Now, whether or not they will be used or jettisoned in the future is, we don't know. But, most of this, I think, comes down to a fundamental error. The first one being that freedom is licentiousness. I think most Christians in America and in the Western world in general believe this, that freedom is at its core the ability to do what I want. As you said, self-governance. This is not a Christian idea of freedom. Freedom is the ability to fulfill without hindrance one's duties towards God, towards one's family, towards one's neighbor. And the reality is, it's interesting to me, you look at the rhetoric in our American politics, which only gets worse and worse every year. And at this point, I think it's getting desperate. Both parties, for example, going on about how this, the election is about preserving or democracy, keeping democracy. Of course, we're the least democratic this country's ever been at this point in history. But what's much more interesting to me is while they are harping on that silly idea, certainly since 2016, but maybe it began in 2008. There was a shift in, I think, the way people discussed, say, our presidential elections in this country. What you heard over and over and over again in 2016 was, well, Donald Trump does not represent me, or Hillary Clinton doesn't represent our values. So always this idea of the figure of the president representing in some sense collectively the American people as an embodiment of the people and or the values, whatever those are, of this country. Now that's peculiar because, of course, from a strictly founding document point of view, that is not the role of the American president. He is to be the executor of the laws and really should have very little direct control over the average person. Certainly, he is not the father of the nation. And yet, as you pointed out earlier, We are now living in this strange dichotomy where both candidates get up there and go on and on and on about preserving democracy, while all the rhetoric is, well, so-and-so doesn't represent us and our values as a people. I would submit that whatever democracy this country may have had ended at some point between 1860 and 1960. And that what we are now doing is living in the embers of that idea, when in fact our government is essentially transitioning to something which is much more akin to the human need, that is the father of a nation, some kind of monarchy, but it will be something altogether dark, because we live in an age of technology, civic confusion, lack of culture, and a level of diversity of thought that will mean it is fundamentally impossible outside of pure authoritarianism for a leader of this country to represent the people.
Well, as you aptly put, the idea of freedom, I would almost see, talking about, license, whatever you want to do. I think you almost have two definitions of freedom emerging. One definition of freedom is, let me live my life as long as in peace the way I choose. And the other idea of freedom is everybody has to accept me. I have the right to have you conform to the way I want to live, use my pronouns, accept me in whatever I'm doing. My idea of freedom is I get to be accepted in what I'm doing, as opposed to I have autonomy to live the way I would. And quite honestly, neither one of those are the Christian concept of freedom. Freedom is the ability to do what to do what you should under God's law. Because we have to remember that we have original sin in there pulling us in a direction that we should not be going. If you're going to sin, the state cannot stop you from sinning, but it certainly can make sure you don't do it publicly, and the public doesn't have to acknowledge, recognize, or applaud your sin.
That's right. And of course, this is where we get into the difficulty of, well, how then do you have a Christian civilization? Because we also want to, I think, avoid rightly any kind of Erastianism. The church is not a compartment of the state, or vice versa. But again, this comes down to, I think, the fundamental meaning then of culture. Classically, the culture of a people came from the cultus of the people, from the worship of the people, what a people considered to be of the highest order and value. Well, as you just put it, in our present Western world, I think it's fair to say the highest order and value is myself, and which has now gone into abject absurdity. This idea that my truth, whatever that might be, is so absolute that it must be accepted and celebrated by everybody else. And I don't know how you practically can have a civilization that lasts very long with that kind of mentality, because there will inevitably be conflicts. My truth will always conflict with somebody else's truth at some level, even if this is simply an emotional or experiential level. And so if all you have is this appeal to absolute individualism, and freedom is the safeguarding of my ability to be that absolute individual without any constraints, how do you have any kind of civic cohesion? But at this point, the only way I think we can re-achieve it is not through electing any kind of leader. Good gracious, that will certainly not do it. We have to do, I think, what the Christians of the first 5, 6, 7 centuries did. The Roman Empire was not Christianized because there was some kind of political revolution or some grand election. It was because Christians lived their Christianity without fear of the state, and without trying to create some fantasy that the state was anything other than an organization that at the end of the day, as Pius XI put it, must recognize that it should reflect the values of Christ the King. He is the Lord over every single government, and it's only by Christians living as Christians, and in that sense converting their fellow people, that we will then have a renewal of Christian civilization.
Exactly. You mentioned Pius XI there. I'm going to go one back to Leo the 13th and bring up the idea, which also ties into the economy a little bit, which I think is something I'd like to cover just a little bit. Is one of the things that was so revolutionary when Leo the 13th wrote the encyclical Rerum Novarum about the new things, which was the relationship between capital and labor, was that he did not establish the idea that that labor, the idea of labor revolting against capital, and the idea that that there should be some sort of an ironing out of society. He went back and said, no, actually, that nature, an aristocracy or a ruling class is very natural to human society. Democracy is something that has to be imposed or maintained. Hierarchy is actually the natural structure of human society, but that there is an obligation, a moral obligation, natural moral obligation, even before you bring divine law into it, for the ruling class, the moneyed classes, whatever you want to call them, to take care of and to have an obligation towards those who work for them and who are their dependents, so to speak. That it actually is not the government's job to make sure that the worker gets his fair due by some sort of taxation and redistribution. It is not the job to break down the moneyed class or the upper class or the aristocracy down to a level that is more compatible with their fellow man, so that everybody is closer to being equal. It is instead the moral obligation of those who are the moneyed class, the ruling class of the aristocracy, to see that those in their employ, under their patronage or what have you, are properly taken care of and have the means to succeed in their daily lives. It is a matter of moral obligation. The economy is something that is an intrinsic element of the way human society works, and not something that needs to be imposed from without, and fits into the hierarchy of mankind and is not something exempt from it.
That's right. I mean, this secular dogma of equality is another one of those pernicious lies. First of all, the only foundation we have for any kind of equality is the scriptural point of view, that we are equal in terms of our ability to worship and commune with God, the Imago Dei. That is true equality. Every single human who's ever lived has the same divine will for their life, to know, love, and serve God in this world, and to be happy with Him forever in the next. And so it's interesting then, you're right, a hierarchy and these sorts of things are eminently natural. There are people that are our betters in all kinds of ways. And I think we tell ourselves this lie from two different perspectives in modern America when it comes to the economic ramifications of this. You've got the right in this country, generally speaking, has this idea of the acquisition of wealth as an absolute good. Capital being part and parcel with the American way, and part of success is making as much capital as you want, and then in turn being able to use it however you want. The left, which equally loves their capital, and any one of them who claim they don't is fooling themselves. But they have this idea that is correct, I think, that maybe there is some sort of problem in a society if you've got the kind of disparity where X individual is hoarding billions and billions of dollars and the other person over here is homeless. The problem with the left is that they then take the responsibility for equalizing the distribution of the wealth to the government, which of course will never do so. So both sides of the political spectrum are wrong, and the only way you overcome this is with a correct Christian understanding of responsibility. And so, in a more simplistic way, I think this is what you see in theory with, say, certain forms of feudalism. You have an idea where wealth is possessed by the lord of the manor, and then he, in turn, has to use that wealth in some kind of way to support those who live and work on the manor, because they, in turn, produce the means by which he acquires that wealth. Because you have a whole system here, then, of duties and rights and responsibilities that's cyclical. Chesterton, his idea of distributism in the economy, I think, is an attempt to find a more modern application of those principles. And I'm not saying I know how we can practically do that in a society of over 300 million people with all different points of view and an overloaded government and all the rest of it. But stealing money from people on the one hand, or hoarding money because that's your right, either one of those points of view are incompatible with a Christian understanding of duty and charity.
No, it's true. I tend to disagree with the idea of distributism only because the fact that someone is given something doesn't mean that they're going to use it effectively, take care of it, or make it prosper, and that it's almost better if you want something, say property, that you're required to make a little bit of effort to get it, to show that you actually do want it, and you'll take care of it. So and that can lead into the issue of making it difficult to achieve the things you want to get, but and I want to say it was Chesterton as well, but I could easily be wrong. But one of those writers in that kind of between the wars, Balak Chesterton, somebody like that, talked about how many, if not most, modern problems were created by somebody being in a place and not being responsible, not doing their job properly, being lazy, or what have you, because they were put there. Whereas if they were somebody who, it required them to get there, and they could lose their position, and there was a element of responsibility, you wouldn't have had it. So the idea of distributism, where everybody gets a house, well, no. And if the fact that one person is going to buy up more houses, okay, fine. They then need to, and I think that's where I'm going to touch very briefly on this. And the question of taxing, the question of the government's right to tax, and its extent and things like that. I think it is entirely reasonable. In fact, I would almost say that it's essential. One of the things of the government is, because it is the idea of justice, is that if someone were to say buy up a whole bunch of houses and then or either hoard money when there are those in need in society, or to buy up, say, large pieces of property and hold on to them and not use them, the government would come in and say, you need to put this money to work, or we're going to take it. I think the government has a right to, not to tax it directly, but to threaten that tax, to say, you need to reinvest your success back into the community. Again, that moral obligation. If the person is not fulfilling that moral obligation or finding ways around it, I think the government does have a right to, if they're not going to fulfill that moral obligation to then tax the money, or then to but it really should be something that's done punitively if the person isn't already fulfilling their obligation, more so than proactively, without giving the person the ability to do it, to do what he should be doing.
Well, right, and of course, I think one of the difficulties with that today, rightly, is, as it's been pointed out, I think on both sides of the American political spectrum, the taxation being what it is in this country, and yet how much of the money acquired through these forms of taxation have left this country, have gone elsewhere entirely, not being reinvested into the citizenry, into the infrastructure, what have you. That's a legitimate point, which only further goes to show, I think, that we tell ourselves lies about not just what this government is for, but what it actually is presently. And I would go so far as to say it is immoral for a government to tax its people to the level ours does, and then to send that money elsewhere when there are legitimate problems in our own society. No, I don't think you can solve homelessness and poverty and things like this by government fiat. This is where the church's role is so important, and we should not acquiesce this role. But I think it is also equally fair to say that foreign countries do not require millions and millions and millions of dollars when we have people on the streets here.
No, absolutely, and you have that, and I really think that there's a conspiracy, and I'll use that word. It may or may not be true, theory going around, because there's evidence that it is, but that the left in this country, the progressive left, and I won't say Democrats because there are Democrats that do not believe this, is so set on the idea that Western culture was constructed, poorly or badly or against certain groups, what have you. They're looking for the destruction of it. And one of the ways that they're doing it in the U.S. is, again, as you say, taxing us above what is moral. And really, the 2020, I remember when I was working in San Francisco a number of years ago, I was taxed 25% federal and 5% state. That was 30% tax, and I was well below making six figures, and I was basically taxed into poverty. And then take that money, and you're right, to give it to Ukraine or whatever the country, the country du jour is who needs money, and take this, and you can see that it's people don't really want it. It's part of an agenda. There's no oversight. There's no accountability. It really has hit a level of immoral that is kind of staggering to look at, and it's fascinating. In fact, it's something that I find. One of the things I find most confusing and most fascinating about our current government, the way it works, is that no one seems to be able to stop it. Something we have with immigration, people coming in here en masse, and no one seems to be able to stop it. I thought we had three branches of government. Can't one of the branches, like, if the House representatives belong to the Republicans and the Democrats are doing it, do something to filibuster this? They don't. They don't seem to be able to stop it. Same thing with this uncontrolled spending. I find it fascinating that we're supposed to have, checks and balances to make sure that our government doesn't, overstep its boundaries, and yet it is, and it is blatantly so, and it is, gratuitously so, and no one seems to be able to stop it.
No, our government bureaucracy has become entirely unaccountable to anybody, and I think the halls of government themselves have largely become a means to self-aggrandizement, and that is true regardless of one's political affiliation. Both of the primary parties in this country are deeply, deeply immoral in many respects, and neither one of them, at their core, have any interest whatsoever in the furtherance of anything good in society.
So I want to make one final comment, and then I'll let you make your point. I don't want this podcast, we said, to keep it within an hour. Touching on 2 points I want to make. The first is that people will often say you should be patriotic for your country because you were born there. And that is absolutely not true. If the country that you're born into is immoral or is not built in the gospel, not only are you not required to be patriotic, but you can, it should be Christian. Christianity is truth. This can be shown with naturally and supernaturally the teachings of the Jews, fulfilled by Christ, carried on in the church, have tamed more than one barbarian society and brought peace and prosperity. The United States was founded, there were Christians there, but it was not founded upon the gospel. And we have seen in less than 250 years, it has been turned into a complete moral, morass, frankly. It is not, no one has an no one has an obligation to be patriotic to the nation they were born in. In fact, they have an obligation to work on converting it and making it Christian. However, there is still an obligation. Taxing to support the infrastructure and the security and such is an obligation of a citizen. It is not really, I can't see how it's an obligation to pay any more than, say, 10% of one's total income. So if someone were to tax shelter or hide from excessive taxation, I don't see how that could be considered immoral. But I think up to 10% for the roads you drive in, the water you drink, the police who patrol the streets, the military that's secure. I think entirely avoiding taxes, I believe, would be immoral. But anything more than 10% of what you earn going into a tax structure, I think that it also is basically immoral. Outside of some major, some sort of emergency or what have you. Normally speaking, I do not believe that's moral, and that anything more than, say, 10%, if someone were trying to tax shelter or hide or not pay that money, would be acceptable.
Well, and of course, the irony is rich that our level of compulsive taxation in this country now is far beyond the accusations made against dear old King George and our whole, again, founding myth and all of that. So, I don't really have a lot of patience for anybody who wants to still talk as if anything at all that would have spurred on the founding fathers isn't much, much, much worse today than it was then. But you talk about patriotism, and I think that word patriotism is oftentimes a cover for just blatant idolatry. Patria, of course, as you know, the idea of that is tied to a sense of land, and, well, if I can use the German term, Volk, because I think it's a better term in terms of what we mean here, one's own people. So to be patriotic, classically speaking, is to have genuine charity, love, and support for one's land and for one's people, both their family, their ethnic people. It has nothing to do, classically, with a government system. You are not patriotic for your government. You are patriotic for your land and for your people. And so, this is why, and I know some would disagree with me on here, but too bad. I deeply, deeply do not like national flags in churches. I deeply don't like it. They have no business in the church. You pray for your country. You pray for its leaders. And in fact, if you look in the prayer book, you don't find anything about praying for government systems and bureaucracies. Who do you pray for? The president, the governor. You pray for people, not for system. This is why I find in the American prayer books the phrase, God save the state, or Lord save the state, to be a very peculiar idea. God save the king makes sense. It's a person. You pray for people. So I think we have to reevaluate this sort of facile idea we have of what patriotism is. And Christians need to begin to divorce themselves from their love affair with the American myth in terms of government. It has not helped us, and it is, I think, done more to harm the goal of the faith than almost anything else in recent history.
No, it's true. I'm going to lie a little bit and make one final comment here. Two things. First of all, I say, as even though the term has been taken by the left and turned into something bad, I think Christian nationalism really is what needs to be in America, the Christian states of America. And I'm actually going to disagree with you a little bit on the idea of Erastian. I'm actually a little bit fond of Erastianism because I think that it should be a Christian prince's obligation to secure the nation in a godly manner. He should have an obligation to that nation that it be a Christian nation, which doesn't mean people who aren't Christian can't live comfortably there, but that the Christian morals and law and rules should dominate. And as a result, I think he should have the ability to make decisions, even to work with clergy, especially a senior clergy who are amenable to him. To be able to do that, he should have both the obligation and the authority to secure domestic tranquility under Christian auspices.
Well, and who better than Anglicans to establish the state church?
True enough. All right, Father. That's as Cadmus Owens is fond of saying. That's all I have to say about that.
Oh, yeah. I think I will agree with you.